was George Orwell who once wrote that in an age of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. Shireen Abu Akleh was murdered by the forces of the Israeli state precisely because she committed her life to sharing the horrific truths of Israel's cruel treatment of the Palestinian peoples. Shireen Abu Akleh was wearing a bright blue vest marked Press and was standing with other journalists when she was killed. Those journalists present on the scene have reported since that as Shireen Abu Akleh and her colleagues were gathering to report upon the operations of the Israeli forces, that there were no Palestinian militants or fighters present, and nor were there any skirmishes ongoing at that time. As she was felled by the accurate bullet of an Israeli sniper, Shireen Abu Akleh became the 16th Palestinian journalist to have been targeted by the Israeli forces in this manner since 1992. To compound the killing of a person who was a danger to their forces only in her attempt to tell the truth, the Israeli army and government initiated a lie, that Shireen was killed by the wayward bullet of a Palestinian militant. When this was proven to be a lie, in no small part to the testimony of other journalists, one of whom was also targeted that day, and also from Israeli human rights organisations who traced video evidence, the Israeli government asserted that they don't target journalists. 16 dead Palestinian journalists, and the fact that this same army bombed the media offices of Al Jazeera and AP in Gaza only last year make this statement very hard to believe. In our discussion today, it is appropriate that we acknowledge and condemn the deliberate and targeted killing of journalists throughout the world, wherever that may occur. And in 2022, so far, 28 journalists have been killed while carrying out their work, the highest number of whom in Mexico is 9, and an increasing number being viciously targeted by the forces of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine. But it would be untrue to suggest that the Irish people didn't look with revulsion at the slaying of Miss Abu Akleh and the subsequent assault at those who carried her coffin in the days that followed, and not ask what we can do to hold those account for this atrocity. Minister, we simply have to end the cycle of impunity for those who target journalists because they seek to tell the truth. Last week, when members of the opposition sought this session on to condemn the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh, the Taoiseach rightfully included the slaying of all journalists in conflict zones in his response and made specific reference to the Irish journalist Pierre Zakharlovsky while reporting on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Taoiseach was right to make this inclusion, but in doing so highlighted the hypocrisy in response by Ireland and the European Union to these atrocities when applied to the State of Israel, as opposed to the horrors of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, where we very swiftly and promptly engaged in a system of boycott, we sanctioned them and we've divested. And the Palestinian people will be right in asking, why do we not be afforded the same standards? Ireland, Europe and some quarters of the United States have undoubtedly condemned the deplorable killings of Miss Abu Akleh and the immoral actions that saw Israeli forces baton charge mourners at her funeral. But time and time and time again we have witnessed that the Israeli government and the army cares not one iota for her condemnation, with the time now surely arriving to turn our backs on the actions of a state who meet all their criteria in international law for one which is inflicting a system of apartheid on the people of Palestine. Minister, there simply has to be consequences for those who target journalists, be they in conflict zones or elsewhere. Scott Griffin, the Deputy Director of the International Press Institute, wrote yesterday that the most important thing that can be done in cases targeting media and violent acts is accountability. He said, "It sounds very simple, but it isn't. We know that in at least 90% of cases in which journalists are murdered, those responsible are not held to account. The failure to respond quickly to attacks on journalists and to hold those responsible for the initial attacks creates what we call a cycle of violence, a cycle of impunity where those responsible feel that they can act without consequence, and we see it as an open invitation to attack journalists. The attack of building last year, the attack of journalists 12 months later. His colleague Anders Menville agreed that ending impunity is crucial to ending the killing of journalists. If there is no judicial response, the number of killings will continue to grow and to grow and to grow. In his previous contribution, Minister Coveney outlined the steps that he feels the Israeli authorities must take in order to bring those responsible for the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh to justice. But we must ask, what does the Minister or the Government intend to do if that call once again falls upon deaf ears? Do we now simply add the deliberate killing and targeting of journalists to the list of injustice inflicted upon the Palestinian people that we are willing to condemn but not willing to act upon? Minister, in this chamber we are paying honour to those who lost their lives in order to speak the truth. In doing so, I implore you to play the fullest honour to and describe the actions of the Israeli state as being exactly the actions of the Israeli state as being exactly as they are in its most truthful term, that of constituting the crime of apartheid. Apartheid is not about phraseology; it is actually enshrined in international law, and they are meeting those conditions. The most truthful thing we can do is call that out. Apartheid has no place in the world. States that choose to make allowance for Israel will find themselves on the wrong side of history. I briefly want to turn to the issues being faced by journalists in the Western Sahara. The Moroccan authorities continue to violate the rights of pro-independent Sahrawi activists through ill treatment, arrest and harassment. Amnesty International reported that in May 2020, Sahrawi journalist and human rights activist Ibrahim Amerkel was arrested in Laayoune in Western Sahara and detained for over 2 days. 3 security officers interrogated him about his work for Sahrawi human rights organisation Nashata Foundation and repeatedly beat and insulted him. They forced him to sign a confession to trumped-up charges of throwing stones at police officers in April. 2 days later, he was charged with breaking orders related to the health emergency status and offending public health officials under Article 263 of the Penal Code. His trial opened on the 18th of November was postponed due to an unknown date, as reported in the Amnesty International report of 2020 and 2021, The State of the World's Human Rights. Amnesty International also reported that in May 2021, the authorities arrested Ezebeh Yadi, a Sahrawi journalist and director of the online Algaraga media company, at his workplace in Western Sahara. They interrogated him about his journalistic work and accused him of filming military barracks in Dakhla, a city in Western Sahara. On the 29th of July, he was sentenced to 1 year in prison and a fine. In Dakhla, his prison, he was denied medical attention for pre-existing hearing and sight conditions, as reported in the Amnesty International report mentioned previously. Human Rights Watch have reported harassment of journalists, such as in the case of Nasra El-Qaid, who was arrested twice for simple reporting of Sahrawi protests against Moroccan human rights abuses. Morocco has been using Israeli spyware Pegasus to spy on journalists. These abuses against journalists are part of a wider pattern of human rights abuses and repression by Morocco directed by the Sahrawi activists, directed at Sahrawi activists, such as the treatment of Sultana Kaya, who Frontline Defenders report has been repeatedly raped and sexually assaulted by Moroccan authorities. There is a UN mission in occupied Western Sahara, the MINURSO, but they do not currently have a human rights observation mandate. While the political solutions for the referendum on self-determination remain deadlocked, it is essential that the MINURSO be given human rights observation mandate. Until recently, the Irish Army provided 2 officers to MINURSO, but these have been withdrawn. It is a pity that we are withdrawn from Western Sahara at a time when we could use our UN Security Council seat to improve MINURSO and to protect human rights in the Western Sahara region. When the MINURSO mandate comes before the United Nations Security Council in October, it is essential that we use our voice on the UN Security Council to push for the human rights observation mandate to be included.